Afternoon. We come in our daily Bible reading to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and unsurprisingly, chapter 9 takes place in the immediate context of, you guessed it, chapter 8. In chapter 8, Paul is dealing with a tough issue for the Corinthian Christians. What do we do with meat sacrificed to idols? Can we eat of it? Should we eat of it? Can we buy it and sell it in the marketplace? Well, how do we approach as Christians this idea of meat being sacrificed previously to idols or false gods? And Paul makes the point very clear in chapter 8 that an idol doesn't exist. It's not anything. There is only one God. There is only one Lord in Christ Jesus. And so we don't have to worry about those things. However, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 is perhaps best summarized by explaining what it means to be sacrificially loving of our Christian brethren. In verse 1, he would talk about the importance of love and how love builds up in chapter 8 and verse 1. And notice in verse 13, the last verse of the chapter, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." Paul's conclusion is that even though he may have some individual rights or liberties within the kingdom of Christ to eat this meat that had been sacrificed to, well, nothing, if my brother thinks it's something, if it distracts him, if it pulls him away, if it destroys him, the text would say, in his soul and his standing before God, that's a sin on my conscience. That's a sin against my Lord, and that I have to answer for the day of judgment if I cause my brother to stumble or sin. And so in chapter 9, Paul is going to continue this theme of then what do we do? Well, as he concluded at the end of that chapter, we might need to be willing to completely set aside a liberty that we even deserve, if not certainly are entitled to, with the privileges within the kingdom of Christ of recognizing what is right and wrong and what is what we might call individual discretion. Notice how he continues this line of reasoning in verse 1 of chapter 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Now, if you highlight verses, I know that was a lengthy reading, but highlight that last verse, and particularly the last phrase of verse 12. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. This is the message of chapter 8 and 9. And more importantly for Paul in his context, he's saying, look, you look to my example of what it means to be sacrificial. Notice the phrase in verse 12. We have not made use of this right, this freedom, this discretion that Paul had, that Barnabas had. He had the ability to marry a believing spouse. He had the ability to be compensated financially for his work in preaching the gospel to the Corinthians and perhaps in other places as well. And yet he didn't make any use of those, even though they were his right. Even though we might use the phrase such as he was entitled to it, he stepped away. And why? Well, for one very clear reason. The end of verse 12, to put no obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. That is sacrificial love. Now, Paul goes through and makes some arguments as to his examples of why we should believe his apostleship, of why he absolutely is serving the Lord first and foremost. But he's also laying down the perfect pattern for us of how to look at something that we have or are entitled to, and that we might need to say no to if it would better serve Christ's kingdom for us to abstain. Remember in chapter 8, it might be better for Christ's kingdom for me to avoid even eating meat if it would cause my brother to stumble. And here in chapter 9, Paul makes several different examples. Going back to verse 1, he says, look, I am free. Rhetorically answering that question, I am free. I am an apostle. You are my workmanship. If anyone has a special claim to you, if everyone has special claims or abilities or powers or accolades or resume, it's me. Paul says it's me, but I don't live for that. Remember verse 12, I'm living for the gospel of Christ. Now in verse 3, this is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along, there it is, a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Was it wrong for Peter to be married? Well, no. Is it wrong for a preacher to be compensated or an apostle to be paid financially for doing the work of the Lord? No, of course not. And that's really in that section of verses 7 through 12, the beginning part. Someone is worthy of their wages, whether it's someone working in a field, whether it's a soldier going for battle. People are worthy of their wages. Now, we use this passage, and rightfully so, to discuss preacher compensation and all kinds of other things within the church. But really, there's a bigger point being made. Paul says, look, yes, I am entitled to that as an apostle who has ministered to you with the gospel of Christ. But what is he actually bringing that up for? To point out this is what sacrificial service looks like. There are things not just that I could have, but that I even might be said to deserve. And I have to say, no thank you in the name of God. Now, I want to stop for a moment and say, well, not all of us are apostles, but frankly, none of us are. What is the application of this? Well, yes, chapter 8, I have to worry about my brethren, but notice Paul does this in basically a generic way. What are some things in a generic way that I might have to sacrifice in the name of the gospel of Christ being spread? It might be in how I spend my time. I might look around and see some needs to be filled and think, well, it's not really my job individually. I don't have to do that. I'm not the closest person to them. I don't live the closest. My phone's not working right now. But sacrificially, loving my brethren means I will put myself last, and I'll go the extra mile, as Jesus might say. Or maybe it's even just how I study the gospel and the Bible message itself with my family. Maybe it might be that, yes, we all answer for ourselves and that we do some good Bible reading as a group and we do some good Bible reading as a family, but maybe we set aside extra time for prayer. Maybe I set aside some time for praying and fasting, as we would find some New Testament examples of. There's all sorts of things and ways that we might sacrifice our liberties in the name of serving God. I think one of the biggest ones today that screams to mind is politics. Whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, or anything in between or outside of that, it might be that it's better for me to not share that and rather than send people away from the message of Christ. How great would it be if people only knew that we were Christians and that when we talked about what was important when it comes to the gospel of Christ, that they knew that this is someone who cares about what God says. They don't get entangled in the things of the world, and if they do, they don't let it bog them down. They focus on serving God. That allows our voice to be all the stronger on what truly matters, and that is the soul. And so as we continue in our reading in verse 13, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jew I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I myself became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. And again we come to our main point. What does Paul say? I do it all for the sake, verse 23, of the gospel, that I might share it. And even in verse 22, that by all means I might save some. Paul cares about souls. He's not distracted about earthly things. He's not distracted about money. He's not distracted about family or marriage or anything. And all of these things are rights. We are entitled to, we might say, that we can work for a living and deserve pay, that we can marry a believing spouse and not worry about whether or not that is allowed. It is. But Paul says, I make no use of this. But notice beyond that in verse 19, though I am free for all, I made myself a servant to all. That is the very definition of sacrifice. To say that I'm going to make myself a servant of all is to say my will comes last, that others come first. That's so crucial and important for us to understand in Paul's message, and certainly Jesus lived out this example as well. We live to serve God and serve others. And what does this look like for Paul in his evangelism and his apostleship? Well, in verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew, To those under the law, I became as one under the law. When we see verse 20, there's a lot of language, and sometimes we might see that wrong, but notice what he says. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. Now, there's a lot of confusing language maybe for us, but what he's saying is to the Jews, I didn't become a Jew in the sense that I bound myself to the law of Moses. I'm not part of that. I'm part of the law of Christ. I belong to Jesus. I'm not bound by, thankfully, the law of Moses anymore. But for the Jews, I made sure to follow their customs insofar as it didn't conflict with the goodness of Christ. I made sure that I would do whatever it takes to make sure my message is understood and heard by them without compromising the actual gospel message. And so again, what do we have? Paul sacrificing liberty. Now, this is apparent throughout his evangelism, but whether it's Timothy and Titus and having one circumcised and the other remaining uncircumcised, we know we're not bound by the law. And yet Paul says, I'm willing to go the extra mile again, that the gospel might be preached, and in order to, quote, save some. Now, as you go to verse 21, to those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. Now, does this mean he went around and was sinning? Well, no. Just like he wasn't, again, subservient to the true law of Moses, as if that was some sort of saving covenant or doctrine. To those outside the law, notice what he says in parentheses here in 21, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. Paul says you have to meet people where they are at. That doesn't mean participating in sin or in wrong delusions of what it means to serve God. But it does mean that maybe I don't stand for every right, every privilege, every liberty that I have and say, you should see it my way. Rather, I should focus on serving God, giving him the glory, and making sure that nothing stands in the way of me serving God and someone else serving God as well. Anything in this life can serve as a distraction, even good things, even things that Paul would continually describe in the English Standard Version as his rights, things that we might say he's entitled to. They can stand in the way of the gospel-saving message. Make sure that I don't put myself in the way of God's message, but rather try to shine the light that Jesus did. Follow in his example, follow in Paul's in sacrificial service. Now in verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. There's a powerful illustration here when it comes to running this race and training. But again, what is the concept of 1 Corinthians both 8 and 9? Sacrificing things I'm entitled to for others. All right, now think about someone who's training for a sport, whether it's basketball or running in particular. There's a lot of cardio work that has to be done. There's a lot of self-denial when it comes to food that we are allowed to eat that are certainly within our bounds as Christians to partake of. But if we have a goal, we're willing to sacrifice to reach it. How important is that goal of heaven? How crucial is it to be with God forever? It's worth everything. And so in verse 25, if an athlete exercises self-control in all things to receive a perishable wreath, what about our imperishable one? It's worth any and every sacrifice. And so again, we ask for application. What can we do? What can we give up in the service of God today? Well, that answer should be anything that's not the actual will of God. I should be willing to give up anything that gives me comfort, anything that brings me physical, earthly joy in the name of serving God better. Now, do we have these rights? Yes. Can we enjoy these rights? Yes. Please don't take 1 Corinthians 8 or 9 to say it's wrong to do these things. Peter had a wife. Just because Paul didn't mean Peter was wrong. But if something comes in the way of us and God, we need to make sure we sacrifice that. And what we learn from chapters 8 and 9 in the book of 1 Corinthians is if it comes between someone else's faith and God, I need to be willing to set aside my liberty for the sake of the souls of others. I hope you join us tomorrow as we get into 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and see how the church can start to work together.